Hi, my name is Lily Brett and I'm a writer. I've written books of fiction, non-fiction and poetry. I started my writing career as a journalist, a rock journalist. I wasn't really a journalist. I just applied for a job that was a journalist's job. And I got hired, and I don't know why I got hired, because I couldn't load paper into a typewriter. I didn't know how to do it. And I'd never used a tape recorder. But I discovered I loved writing. And not too long after that, the newspaper asked me if I would like to go to London for a few months, and then New York and LA. And this was 1967. You couldn't have had a better year to I just looked aside. You couldn't have had a better year to be going to London and New York and LA. Probably less LA than San Francisco. So I went there. I was very naive. I had no idea how insignificant Australia was to the rest of the world. And in America, they said to me, "What language do you speak in Australia?" So I thought, well, I was overwhelmed by the size of the fridges and the cornflakes packets. So I didn't know that much about the size of the American supermarket, so they didn't know what language we spoke. Anyway, I explained it was English. And I interviewed really just about anyone who was anyone: Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Mick, Jagger, Sonny and Cher, The Who, Mamas and Papas, and a slew of other bands and individuals. And Jim Morrison, a lot of the stars who died. And they were mostly incredibly nice to me. And I asked them a lot of questions. I've always prepared for everything. And I asked them a lot of questions. And I asked them about their families, religion, fame, money. How did they change you? Violence. I asked them about sex and violence, and what was the relationship between an audience screaming and sex and violence. And when I look back on asking them those questions, I thought, why did I ask them those questions? I knew very little about either subject. So I realised after a while I'd asked them nothing about music at all. And I think that's because I really, really wanted to know who they were. I wanted to come away with a picture of who they were and how they'd grown up. And I did, I felt, I just felt a real infinity. I felt just very comfortable and familiar with the people who'd had a rough background. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, quite a few of them had a very rugged childhood, not Mick Jagger. And because it was 1967, I had diamante-lined false eyelashes, fake rubies pasted on my cheeks. The eyelashes were double eyelashes on top and eyelashes on the bottom. And at the Monterey Pop Festival, I wore long psychedelic gowns and had bells around my ankles, and I've never had good ankles. Decades later, I wrote a novel about a young rock journalist, which was loosely based, or not so loosely based, on my life as a rock journalist. And even though Lola Bensky was about, sequins and diamantes and a lot of drugs, I didn't take them, but it was, quite a drug-ridden time. It's just beginning. And that part of it seems frivolous, not the drugs, the eyelashes and the fake rubies. But underneath, there was an underlying issue, even in Lola Bensky, of a theme that would be an underlying theme in everything I wrote. And that was the catastrophic consequences of hatred. And the single most defining aspect of my life is the fact that I was born to two people who were each imprisoned for years in Nazi ghettos, labour camps and death camps. My mother had 4 brothers. She had a mother and father, 4 brothers, 3 sisters, uncles, aunts, cousins, nephews and nieces. Every single one of them was murdered. My mother lost everyone she loved in the world. And my father came from a very large family, and almost all of his family were murdered. My father and mother, they didn't know whether each other was alive. My mother knew most of her family were murdered. She saw her sister, her older sister, murdered. My mother found my father in a refugee camp. In those days, they were called DP camps, displaced persons camps. And I was one of the first group of children born to survivors of death camps. We arrived in Australia when I was about 2. And I was really lucky because, or we were really lucky because we weren't sent to a camp called Bonagila, which was laughingly called a registration and training camp. And it was held in former army barracks. And it was situated, there were no main cities nearby, and it was situated in such a way that they couldn't get to Sydney and they couldn't get to Melbourne. And there was very, very little heard about that until in 1949, 13 children died of starvation. And then there was a bit of news about it. And somebody at the facility decided that a really good way to teach the refugees and immigrants would be to teach them Scottish folk songs. And my mother's really good friend, Topcha, in her 70s and 80s, could still sing what she called Roaming in the Gloaming. And that was a Scottish folk song called Roaming in the Gloaming. I don't know what a gloaming is still, and I didn't improve anybody's English. But we were lucky, we were given a room in a house, and there was 5 rooms and 1 family in each room, and they were all Jewish. And any Jewish person who survived the Nazi era in Europe, whether they were in hiding or posing as an Aryan or in one of the many ghettos, death camps, labour camps, not one of them had a picnic. All of them had suffered massively. And so, we were 5 families in 5 rooms, 1 kitchen and 1 bathroom. And I was little, and I could feel the air was saturated with grief. I already knew something terrible had happened. But the other thing was, there was also a very strong will to live. And in that house, I didn't know we were poor. I didn't know people didn't live this way. I mean, when you've been in refugee camps and you don't know that you're not always surrounded by a lot of people. And I loved the people. I loved them all. They were so loving and kind and so happy to have children around, even if they weren't their children. And, my parents and a lot of the community we lived in, my parents lost everything they could have lost. They lost their families, they lost their culture, they lost their education, they lost their youth, they lost their language. They spoke several languages. One of them was English. But the one thing they didn't lose was the ability to love. And I was very, very lucky to grow up in the middle of that love. And I saw it around me in our house, in our crowded house, because not only was it crowded with people, it was crowded with the dead. You could feel the dead. But I was very lucky because there was a love that was in that house. And I felt extremely loved